Hi there. In this tutorial I'm going to demonstrate how to set up a slightly more advanced version of the volumetric lighting that I've demonstrated in some earlier tutorials, otherwise known as God rays. So you can see them on the screen now, and I'm essentially just using a lamp, but I'm modifying the light from the lamp slightly, and this is all rendered in EV, although it will render just as well, if not slightly better, in cycles, but it will take a little longer and be a little more noisy potentially. So you can see there's a very, very bright lamps that are shining on the objects I've got in the scene, and yet they seem to have almost a rim to them. So there's a very simple trick to get that. And then towards the end of this demonstration, you can see I've got some sort of textured mist or fog, rather than it just being homogeneous. So I'll show you how to do that as well. If you enjoy these tutorials, don't forget to click like and subscribe. Feel free to comment or ask questions, or even dislike the video. And if you don't like the video, I'd be very interested to see what the issues you spotted were, so that I can improve going forward. If you're a Patreon supporter, I do upload these files for any use available to my Patreon supporters, and I upload tutorials quite regularly. So let's start the tutorial. So to begin with, we need a few things in our scene for the light to shine onto. So I've just got this table and this photogrammetry object that I created a while ago. And I discovered an interesting little trick while I was setting this up. If you've got two Blender windows open, you can just copy from one Blender window and paste into another in terms of objects. I was unaware that you could do that. Previously, I've always used a pen. So that's a handy little trick. So we've got our basic objects, and I'll change to EV, and we will go to rendered view. And you can see we just got this dull scene at the moment because it's got a grey background. So I'm going to add a light or a lamp, and we're going to make it the spotlight. And we'll move that up. You can see it's just briefly illuminated my object there. And if we go to the lamp settings, we can change the size of the light. So I used a very narrow lamp, so we'll bring it into something like that, about 6 or 7 degrees, something like that. But I used a very, very bright lamp as well. So at the moment it's only 10 watts. I'm going to set that to 9,000 watts. So now you can see it's really bright, almost blowing this out. And if I rotate on the X a little bit, you can see how it's just shining down there. You can also see, because we're in EV, that the shadow resolution is very low. In order for us to be able to see what we're doing a little better, I'm just going to go to EV settings. I'm going to turn on screen space reflections, so that will just help with a little bit of bounce light for EV. And then I'm going to go to shadows. And you can see cube size is 512. So I'll set that up to 1024, and you can see that immediately becomes a finer shadow. And I could go even higher, but obviously that will have a cost in terms of render time. And we'll also just put this up to 2048, although you won't see any initial difference. It may improve it slightly. But the reason I don't need to go too high is because I'm also going to turn on soft shadows. And now you can see it's smoothed all of that out. It's not a higher resolution, but it's doing a little fudge to smooth the shadows, so that's fine. So I'm going to turn the background down to black now. And I'm also, just to stop the confusion, I'm going to turn all the grids off. So all we can see is whatever's illuminated directly or indirectly by this lamp now. I'll just turn it a little bit further that way, so it's only just illuminating the corner of that. So now to get that circular lamp, I just need to add a mesh circle. And we'll just lift that up. I'm going to just remove the rotations on that lamp just to make things easier. And I want this circle really, gone into orthographic there, be high enough to be out of the view of the camera. It's not going to be that visible, but there will be an effect. So what I'm doing is shrinking it to be slightly smaller than the size of my lamp. I'll go into edit mode and just press F to fill the center of that circle. And we'll just set a default material for it. And before we go to render view, what I want to do with the disk selected, I'm now going to select my lamp and just say Control P and say object. So that now means when I rotate my lamp or move it, that little disc will go with it. So if we come down here now and go into rendered view, and we can rotate our lamp. Now at the moment you can see that disc isn't having much of an effect, and the reason is because of the size of my lamp. So I'm going to set that down to 0, and you can see suddenly the disc casts a shadow. As it goes higher, effectively the lamp is bigger than the mask object I'm using, the object I'm using to cast a shadow, so more light effectively goes around it. But for our purposes, 0 is absolutely fine. You can see there's a blend mode on as well, and that's giving us this fuzzy line. If I turn that up, it'll actually get dimmer. So I'm just going to set that to 0. The actual lines you can see here is the texture of the wood. If you want to see exactly where your cone is going to be, you can turn it on there. The other thing I did, because this is all about volumetric, is I turned up the number of bounces for volumetric light. Essentially, it makes the volumetric bounces seem a little brighter because more light is bouncing. So I set this to 3, and that's about all we need for the lamp other than setting a colour. So we'll set this one to a nice bright yellow, and then I will select both my lamp and its mask object, and we'll create another one pointed something like that, and let's make that one a bright red, and then a final one which we'll set to a nice bright green, I think. And there are 3 lamps just shining rather nicely there. So all very simple, and we'll just come out of rendered view, and we now need to put a volumetric in here. So let's just add a simple cube, scale it up to be bigger than our scene. At this point I'm just going to make sure where my camera is, just to make sure it can see what's going on, and that makes it easy to come back to it. So I've got my volumetric cube. I'm going to open up a new window, and we'll set this to the shader editor, and we'll just say new material, but we don't want this time the principled shader. We don't need that at all. And we'll just add under shaders a volume scatter node. Strictly speaking, it should be a little more complicated than just volume scatter for mist, but for the majority of purposes this works fine. But you do need to make sure that goes into the volume input of material output, nothing else. So we go to rendered view and we'll look through the camera. You may just be able to make out there's something going on there, but it's very dark. And that's because of the density of this volume scatter. I'm just going to set that up on full white, and it's now reflecting so much light that we're actually not seeing anything. The light being bounced around to the point where we're not getting anything. So let's try 0.1 density rather than 1. And now we can start to see things. Obviously this is a preview render at the moment, but nevertheless I think we can improve that a bit by coming over to here under the render properties, go to volumetrics, and under here you can see tile size is 8, essentially this is the resolution of the volumetrics, and change this to 2. You won't have to do that if it's in cycles. You see that's already a little better. I set samples to 256 and turned on volumetric shadows, and you can see it's already starting to look a lot better. You can't go any higher than 2 pixels for the tile size, but you can increase the number of samples. You could go even 512 or something like that. But obviously that will have a hit in terms of render time. I'll go back down to 256 for the moment. You can play around with distribution as well, but be careful. I would suggest you type in values rather than using the mouse wheel, because you can easily crash things if you're not careful with that. And obviously you can go up to more than 16 samples if you want to. You could go to 32 samples for the shadows, which again just makes it a little finer. So you can already see we've got that effect created by the mask. And if that's all you want, there's your setup for the God rays. However, just to show you how we can add a little bit more texture to the effect as well, with the volumetric selected, I'm going to come over to here and I'm going to add, in this case, under textures, a noise texture. I'm going to set it to 4D. And the only reason I did that really is because I wanted to change one parameter, the W parameter, to animate the noise over time, but we'll come to that in a moment. Then I'm going to add, under converters, color ramp, and I'm going to take color output, it actually doesn't really matter which output you take, into the color ramp, and the output of the color ramp into density. Now you can see our fog or mist has disappeared completely. Let's just pull these into the center a little bit. And all this is doing is sort of deciding what parts of the noise are, as it were, white and what are dark. And you can already see we've got some fog or mist here, but it's essentially black here. So now let's have a look at the scale. I used a scale of about 30. So now you can see there's more bits of the scene visible. I put the detail up to 5 and I added distortion of about 5. So that makes it sort of swirly noise rather than simply patches. Maybe we'll go down to 3 on the detail. But you can still see it doesn't quite look right, because it's very unusual to have a kind of mist that is either 100% visible or 100% invisible, which is what we've got here. So I also added, under converters, a map range node and dropped that in there. And that's because I don't want it to go any higher than about 0.1, because we established that was a sort of acceptable level. So you can see the input is going between 0 and 1, which is what this will be doing. But my output, the maximum value for my output, I want to be 0.1. So that's dropped down the maximum value, but I also don't want it to go completely black. So let's put the minimum value to 0.01. And now you can see we've always got some of the mist visible, but it's not all at the same brightness. And that's what then gives you these brighter and darker spots. And then you can decide what kind of variation you want. I used Cardinal, which is quite a sharp fall off to give you a more extreme look. You'll need to find the right point, but you could also use something like B-spline, which would be much more subtle, and it would be very subtle variations. It depends whether you want that old sort of 80s, 90s laser look, or whether you just want a more subtle variation in the mist. And of course you can play with this as well. So you might not want 0.1, you might want 0.08 perhaps as the maximum depth. And finally, of course, you can play with the brightness of the lamps. So this is the yellow lamp. I could go to 20,000 watts. That's now a much brighter lamp. And so the final thing about animating this noise, I used a W value, but I found it didn't need to vary by very much to give quite rapid changes in the apparent movement of the noise. The idea is that it moves the noise through time, so it's not just suddenly changing from one noise pattern to another, it's evolving from one point to another. So you would go to the beginning of your timeline, select the noise texture node, hover over the W value and press I, and then I went to the end of my animation, and all I did was set this to 0.1, so even 0.1 was possibly a little faster than I needed, and then obviously press I again, and that will then change this noise pattern. If I set this back to Cardinal so it's a bit more obvious, you may be able to see, if you recognize some patterns, that they are changing, and they're changing relatively quickly even with 0.1. You may also want to, of course, select that keyframe, go to interpolation and set it to linear so that it's changing at the same speed across the animation rather than speeding up from the beginning and then running to the end. The only other thing I did, which helps if your little masks might perhaps come into the scene, so these little objects up here, an easy way to find them is to go into one of your spots, and then you can see there's the circle there. So we've got that one selected at the moment. Go to the material, set it as a black material first of all, which makes them less visible. It won't change the way it works, but also scroll down here and just say backface culling. And it just makes it much less visible if it happens to impinge on the visible area within the camera. It doesn't change the way it works at all, and you can leave that at default of opaque. If we actually have a look at what's being rendered, you can, if I zoom back a bit, you can see how the volumetrics is solid up until the point that it reaches that little circle. So let's just give this a quick render and we'll see what we've got. So you can see there, we've got this sort of swirly pattern, which will be moving slightly if we rendered an animation. So I hope you found that useful. If you've got any questions, please leave them as comments below the video, whether you liked it or disliked it. Let me know why. I will upload a copy of the original scene for my Patreon supporters to use for any purpose. Otherwise, I will see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.